So we're just about coming on to time. So I want to say welcome to everyone to our final session of the first day of IDTX Online 2025. We're wrapping off the day with an excellent session. I'm really looking forward to this one. Another AHA slide, so a good opportunity to get involved. Please do engage with the interactivity throughout the session. Also, within the next kind of hour and a half, all of today's recordings will be available on the IDT YouTube channel, so you can start reviewing them or sharing them or doing whatever you want to do with them. Thank you so much again for attending so many sessions there. I'm seeing a lot of repeat names here in the chat, so please do get involved, be in the chat, engage with the interactivity. And with all of that said, I'm going to get out of the way and you can start with our session. Thanks so much, and the stage is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tom. I just want to say thank you for being the host and the coordinator for this incredible free or free plus donation opportunity for our industry. It's wonderful that you do that. Had no idea that you've done this for 5 years in a row. So just thank you for taking that on and for contributing to our L&D community. For those of you who don't know me, I am Dr. Elena Schlachta. I tell everyone that I am a data nerd because it is the honest to goodness truth. I absolutely love data. I think it is the greatest asset that we can possibly have in our lives, both personally and professionally. And I'm on a mission to help our industry harness the power of data so that we can have more influence and impact in our work. So this particular 30-minute conversation is really one of those ways to help folks tell a better story of impact. And so without further ado, for those who've joined and haven't jumped into the AHA slides, I see about 6 folks that are in the AHA slides presentation. Grab your phone or snag that link that you see on the left side of your screen and go ahead and join us in the AHA slides presentation. I've chosen to use AHA slides because there are a few times I'd like to collect data and see some themes from all of us who are here today. So please go ahead and do that. And let's get started. So we're here today to talk about alignment. Why alignment? It's this simple. Because alignment, when we say alignment, we mean aligning your work to the business. It's the one thing that distinguishes high-performing learning teams from everybody else. When we can align our initiatives to strategic business outcomes, we have more power and influence and overall impact, which is what we all are here for in the end. And I just want to talk to you quickly about the image that you see. So I've chosen very intentionally a string of very different shapes. And the reason for that is that when we work toward alignment, it can often feel like we're trying to tie together these very disparate things, learning activities with capabilities, with KPIs, with business outcomes. And so I just want to acknowledge that as we build this practice of alignment, we might start by feeling that it's like trying to fit a circle in a square hole and you're trying so hard, and that's normal. But the more that we practice alignment, the more that these disparate shapes will more intuitively fill and float together. And what we're talking about today is going to help you to make that process of alignment more intuitive and build that muscle over time. And I want to say, one more thing about alignment. This is one of my absolute favorite quotes from an author of a book that if you have not read it, it's all about alignment. And some of my inspiration for today's conversation comes from that book. It is called Partner for Performance. Tom, if you are able to maybe snag the link to that book from Amazon and pop it into the chat, it is my absolute favorite book for people to start figuring out how to better align their work to the business. In this quote here is really about, it's not the goal of alignment to be perfect, because perfection is just simply not possible in the world we operate in anytime, any place, ever. But alignment is a series of habits and processes that when we put them in place, we have a practice. And it's the sustainable practice of alignment or attempt or striving for alignment. That's the goal. So I just want to start with that, because sometimes when we think about aligning learning to the business, we're like, well, when do we know that we've made it? When do we know that we've done it? And I want to say it never ends. Alignment is a process, and it's the ongoing practice that matters the most. And if you're curious about more places to read about high-performing organizations, this comes from my own book. It's, again, the inspiration for why I think about alignment in the way that I do. These reports here can be some great continuing reading for you to build upon today's conversations to help you understand the differences between high-performing learning organizations or learning teams and everybody else. So now is the time to jump into your AHA slides. A couple of questions just to get a sense of who's here and what's our experience with our organizational metrics. So the question for us all, how strongly do you agree or disagree with this statement? I know my organization's most important metrics. I'm going to take a swig of water while folks are participating in this, and thank you for doing that. So this particular audience, I like asking this question because every time I do a workshop like this, you just never know where people fall on this. And so it helps me as your facilitator and your guide in this conversation today to figure out where to lean in more around this metrics piece. So it's looking like of the 19 people who have participated, we do have 34 folks here. That I think is a decent sample, not perfect. But it looks like we're not super confident that we know what our organization's most important metrics are. So you're in the right room because at the end of our 30 minutes, we will get clear on that. So you should strongly agree should you ever have to answer this question again. Now, for those of you who mentioned, I sort of feel confident somewhere in the middle or toward the higher end of that scale, I feel confident I know what my organizational metrics are, please go ahead and share them here because I'm curious if they are going to align with the 6 value propositions that we're going to dive into in just a moment. So some folks are typing. Thank you for doing that. Absolutely. We're looking at client retention, sales. These are absolutely some of the most important metrics. There are a handful of metrics. And what I like about this metrics conversation is that the metrics that are most important to a business or to your organization, they don't often change. So once we get clear on what those metrics are, it's something that we can know and understand and have in our back pocket going forward. So we've got some themes here. So what's interesting, and this might be because all the organizations are different types. So we have one response is the results-driven courses, upskilling of employees. That might be an important metric for your department if you're internal as an L&D professional. But for your organization, that metric might not be important to them. It's just a piece of the puzzle toward that organization being successful in whatever it is that it does. Great. So from what I've seen so far, income, excellent. Income, profitability, those are generally the most important, among the most important metrics, absolutely. So I'm seeing about 50% of the most important metrics represented here. So great job. Are you ready to see what those most important metrics are? Let's take a look. There we go. It took me a minute to get that to flip over. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the QR code so we can see this just a little bit bigger. I might have to do that on my other screen too. All right. So as I mentioned, many of you had already shared some of these things. So revenue, net profit, employee retention. I definitely saw that come up in your answers. Absolutely. A couple things that didn't come up that I want to call your attention to are, number one, meeting expectations. So This is one of those catch-all concepts that what's important and what matters to our stakeholders as we work on our value proposition, sometimes the low-hanging fruit is simply to meet their expectations. Quick story about that. My last corporate job before I went out and started my own business, I worked for a very large organization, and the CEO at the time, the number one metric for that particular CEO was NPS score. And we captured the NPS score of all kinds of things, learning included. Now, we could debate the NPS score's utility, but for the types of learning that we were doing, the NPS score was not going to give us the most useful data to know if our programs and initiatives within learning were truly serving the business and the people that we served. I debated with that CEO and gave him a few other examples of metrics that we might lean on to better understand if we're making the kind of contribution to the organization that we wanted to or imagined. And the CEO basically said, I don't care. The NPS score is what I want to track. So, because meeting the expectations of my CEO and returning that data that he requested to me goes a long way in building the relationship with that CEO, I bit my tongue. I closed my heart knowing that there could be way better metrics to use, but my CEO wanted us to use the NPS score. And so I did. We reported back the NPS score within our overall data reporting about how learning was having a contribution to the organization. And it opened the door for more conversations for trust and rapport and respect that over time enabled us to create data collection and report on different metrics. So the meeting expectation thing is a low-hanging fruit way to build the relationships with our stakeholders that help us to gain the influence, the power, the trust, the respect that we need to have the greatest impact that we can. So I want to call that out because it's such a great tool to use in our industry that I don't think we think about enough. The other thing that I want to call to your attention, because this is a big part of creating our value proposition, is understanding what are the metrics that matter to our stakeholders, not necessarily to our learning team, perhaps to our learning team, but definitely to our organizational leaders. So mission fulfillment, for those of you who work in the nonprofit space, there's going to be a core metric that is going to represent, are we fulfilling our mission or not? And that metric is the one that you want to lean on heavily if you're in the nonprofit sector. Then there's net profit. This did not come up in the responses that you shared just in the previous screen. Net profit is a really important metric for all types of organizations, nonprofit, for-profit, government, because net profit is really where we're looking at our revenue or our income versus our expenses. And that net profit number is really the metric that often matters for our compliance, our safety, our risk management. If you're in the security or you're in the safety, what do they call it? Cyber safety. And you're doing training on how not to click on a phishing link in an email, right? Those kinds of programs are all about net profit. We're trying to reduce the risk of the organization because risk often leads to money and that affects our net profitability. So I like to talk about that because it's an important metric that really aligns nicely with any of those compliance, those safety, those required trainings that we all love so much. That net profit is where we want to lean into for our value proposition for that kind of training program. All right, so what we're starting to do here is put the pieces of the puzzle together to create your value proposition. And on the far end of that alignment, remember those disparate shapes I shared with you at the beginning? At the far end of that alignment equation or your value proposition are your stakeholders' metrics that matter. So we want to get really clear, what are those metrics relevant to the initiatives that we're working on? So let's practice that next. I'm going to skip this because I want to get to our framework. Here we go. I love this, and this is what's going to help us to start framing our value proposition. So this work comes from Rob Brinkerhoff, And you have the link here to, or the reference, you can look it up on Google to read the article in more depth. This particular value proposition, the categories are going to help us to create how do we link our training activities all the way up to our organizational metrics that matter. So this is where we start to see the relationship between our learning activities and those strategic business metrics that matter to our stakeholders. So here are the definitions of those 6 value propositions. And I imagine we could probably argue that there's another one that we could think up that could fit within this framework. But I would say for simplicity's sake, Rob did a great job bucketing all the different ways that learning can add value to an organization. And so our job is to put the pieces of that puzzle together. So remember that image of we have these disparate shapes that represent different dominoes, essentially, that we're knocking over to connect our learning activities to business outcomes. And having this language of a learning value proposition from the eyes of the business helps us to make that alignment and that value proposition really clear. So I'm going to pick one of them. Let's see. Let's think about emergency performance. So if you want to use the chat for this one, what type of training might be for the value of emergency performance? Has anyone done something like this, or can anyone think of a just generic example of what kind of training we might do within that bucket of emergency performance? Any ideas? Oh, I love that, Elizabeth. Workplace violence prevention. Yeah. Like Daniel, you're mentioning anything related to COVID. So how to put on your personal protective wear from going back to the office safely. Yeah, that's right. Bank raid training. Tom, great example. So emergency performance oftentimes is like, in the event of an emergency, how do we make sure that our staff, relevant to their function, are prepared? So yes, absolutely. Physical safety. What if there's a bomb? What if there's gunfire? What if there is a hurricane or some kind of weather incident? What if there's flooding? And then, yes, cybersecurity. What if there's a hack in our system? How do we respond? So these are all great examples. Now for the question of the hour, as we're practicing creating that value proposition. I'm going to show you one more slide. Which on the bottom of the screen, you can see the metrics that we just talked about. Which of the metrics between revenue, market share, net profit, employee retention, mission fulfillment, which of those metrics that matter to stakeholders is emergency performance training aligned to? Which do you think is the right? And there could be 2 depending on your mission, but which do you think is the most relevant metric for emergency performance training? Go ahead and throw that in chat. So yes, perhaps mission fulfillment. Tom, you got it. And Marina, net profit. Net profit, remember, is about risk management. So anytime that we're doing emergency performance training, what are we trying to do? We're trying to mitigate risk. That's physical harm that the business is going to have to pay in workman's compensation, or harm to customers that the business might have to pay in the form of future lawsuits, etc. So the violence prevention. So here again, the goal of this is, in our value proposition, is to try and tie how does the different learning value propositions connect to the metrics that matter for our stakeholders. And I picked this emergency performance because it's one that isn't super intuitive. Let's do another one. Let's talk about staff benefits. Which of the metrics that matter to our stakeholders are staff benefits aligned to? We've got revenue, market share, employee retention, net profit, mission fulfillment. Yes, Marina, absolutely. Employee retention. There's another one that also could be relevant here. Anyone have an ideas? It's not revenue. Michael, you got it. Talent attraction, where does that fit in? Market share. So Laura, similarly, providing a talent pipeline, think about market share. So a good example is in the real estate industry or the banking industry, where there's a lot of competition. So there's a lot of different people that could work for different banks. There's a million banks out there. There's a million different types of real estate brokerages. And those types of organizations, call centers, data centers, they're competing for talent. And so market share is about, okay, how can we make sure that, well, there's a lot of ways market share shows up, but in the sense of employee and staff benefits, we want to take the market share as much as we can to have the best talent within our industry, because that builds the business's reputation. It continues to fulfill that talent pipeline. If an organization has a reputation of attracting the top talent, think about law. Anyone ever watched the show? Oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the name. Suits. Suits is a really great example of how one particular law firm is trying to get only the top talent by only recruiting from, I think it was Harvard. Forgive me if I'm misremembering, but it's the idea that we want to have the market share of top talent. So staff benefits, in some cases, can help us to pull in and retain. So it's both. We want to have that top talent. We want to have that reputation. That's all part of market share, because also when we have market share of top talent, what does that do? It makes a higher chance of our customers, our products, all going to be better. And that gives us more market share in the product space. It gives us more market share in the customer space, et cetera. So this is the practice. Remember, alignment is about building the practice of thinking about, how do my simple activities or how do my required trainings align with what matters to the business? And so these L&D value propositions, think of them as like the connector. It's the thing that connects the activities, the courses, the performance support, whatever we're doing, through to the business. So using this language is the kind of thing that stakeholders are going to really appreciate. Oh, we're doing this required, and this is something if a manager pushes back on supporting, which we hear all the time, unfortunately, we need managers to better support us, to reinforce or to step in and facilitate, however your managers need to better support you. Here's why this matters. We're doing this required training because it's a risk management effort to help us make sure that we hit our net profit goals year over year. So this is the kind of language that helps us to make a solid value proposition. So let's tie this all together. And here is just an example of what of those metrics fall into the different value propositions. So feel free to save this, take a screenshot. I'm not sure, Tom, if folks can download this. I'm happy to share a PDF version of this, but this is part of that script that you want to lean on to help you make your value proposition. So if you're supporting job performance, that aligns with revenue and mission fulfillment. If you're in HR and your job is to negotiate the best price for staff benefits, that aligns with employee retention. And if you further that out, that employee retention aligns with net profit and overall profitability. So this is part of that alignment equation, is tying all these things together. Now, for the last bit of the equation, this is where it gets a little more complex, but you've already done the hard work, and all you have to do now is fill in the things in between. So what's pretty easy to understand once we have that language of the learning value proposition, once we practice what's the value proposition for our activity, we can more easily align that to the organizational metrics. That's important, but it's not a complete picture of your value proposition. We need to tie all of these seemingly disparate things together. And so here's the big reveal. What were those shapes that we talked about at the very beginning? Those are our learning programs, our competency metrics, What's that L&D value proposition and the KPIs that might go along with that? And then finally, organizational metrics. So these seemingly disparate things do make sense together once we understand what that value proposition is that we're leaning on. So think of this as pieces of a puzzle. I suggest you start with what's the value proposition that makes the most sense for the training that we're working on. Well, now you've got your learning program connected with that value proposition. So you've got two of those columns filled in. Then once you've got your learning value proposition confirmed, what are the organizational metrics that most aligns with? More than likely, it's going to be one or two only. You're probably not going to have three. Then this is the tricky part. Those things highlighted in yellow are things that either we have to come up with on our own, or we have to investigate by talking to the right people in the organization. So first, let's look at the yellow box on the right, the department-specific performance metrics. Well, once you know your learning value proposition, you've got that language, hey, we're working to help fill that talent pipeline, or we're doing staff benefits, or we're helping to support a new strategy, and you've linked that to the correct organizational metric. Well, why we're focusing on staff benefits is for market share and for employee retention. Well, now it's a lot easier to figure out, well, what are those department-specific KPIs, key performance indicators that we want to see improved and we should be monitoring throughout our initiative. So in some cases, staff benefits, for example, as it relates to employee retention, well, what are those KPIs? One would be how many people are getting the benefits, how many people are using them, and then what's our employee retention year over year relative to those benefits. So this is how it's a puzzle that we're constantly putting together for all of our activities. Now for the tough part. This is really where your work in the world as an expert in behavior change, in learning sciences, behavior sciences, course creation, those competency metrics are not something that we're going to get from a stakeholder. We're going to have to create them on our own unless we have someone who's leading our team that's helping us to create that. This is the most important thing that we very frequently focus on. And that is, what will people be doing specifically to accomplish those KPIs? So this is the piece where if we don't have this clear going into our initiatives, then we'll never be able to create this value proposition and test and prove it over time. So many people try to just focus on attendance rates, completion rates, knowledge retention, and then maybe they tie it to a KPI, or maybe they try to tie it to an organizational metric like, hey, we have orientation, let's tie that to employee retention. It's not sufficient enough to have a value proposition. We've got to have all these other pieces of the puzzle, specifically the competency metrics. What are people going to accomplish? What are they going to do after your orientation? What are they going to do after your leadership training, etc.? Once we've got that clear, now we have all the data that we need to prove, test, monitor, report on, build a dashboard around the data to talk about our impact and our value. So with a whole 2 minutes left, I can take a breath. Thank you for the comments. Folks have said this is gold, that they agree. What other things can I help you clarify or address within this goal of using this framework to create our value proposition? How can I help you put this into practice on your own? I did see a hand go up, but I can't remember who that was. Tom, any thoughts on bringing that person off mute, or feel free to put your question in chat also.
Anyone who wants to can come off mute. Don't have to raise a hand or anything. Or, yep, chuck it in chat, whichever's easiest.
Awesome. Well, Tom, you are an incredible expert in this space. While folks are maybe thinking about questions, I'd love to know from you, if you'd be willing to share, what are your reflections on this? And if there's one action step, Tom, that you might take after thinking about this framework? I'd love to hear that from you, and maybe that can inspire others as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the biggest thing for me is that this sort of I've been encouraging a lot of L&D teams recently to work on this as a major internal project for them, and to view it not only as we tend to view sort of value prop as an important step for showing the business that we're worth having, telling the business how valuable we are. And actually, I think there's an opportunity by going through this process to really reflect on where there's fat in your activity, because certainly whenever I go through this with any L&D team, one of the standout realizations is we're doing a lot of stuff that doesn't match our value prop.
That's right.
That's almost more valuable than communicating out. So I think that's the activity that I always reflect on being the most impactful of doing this. Obviously there's lots of other stuff that comes out the back of it as well, but that's always the thing that when I first did it, it surprised me. And now I almost look forward to that moment more than anything else in the process.
That's right. Yeah. I love the idea of efficiency. Not that it's the only thing we should report on. You'll hear some people say, oh, we cut our learning program down by 10 hours and we saved this much time and staff being off the lines, whatever. That is not a valuable thing. It's useful, but not unless you can tell if that cutting down 10 hours actually gave you the same competency growth, etc. So efficiency is great, though, in that we often do a lot of things. But are those things really contributing to the organization's most important metrics? Why or why not? And for me, as a former leader of a learning team and now business owner, I'm always looking for things that I don't have to do anymore because it saves me time and money. And then it enables me to do better the things that I know have some evidence of working. So I love that reflection, Tom, and that, yeah, sure, use this to prove your value or to test your value as an educator, a researcher. This isn't about proving anything. It's only about testing. Like, sure, we can try to prove it, but it's really a hypothesis until we have enough data to tie all these pieces together and then demonstrate if it worked the way that we thought.
Absolutely. We have got a bunch of questions asking about when people can get their hands on the recording. Literally give me an hour and a half. Google got to do it and get it uploaded. But then everyone who is signed up for the event, you will get an email later today with, hey, here's day one recordings for you. So you don't have to wait too long. I promise.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Tom, for having me be a part of this event. I love talking about these things and I love being helpful. So I hope that folks will lean on the recording so that you can start implementing this, because implementation is where we have the greatest impact, making those changes, having those conversations with your CEO about why the NPS score is not the best idea or what, in addition, we could be reporting back on. So yes, thank you all. And find me on LinkedIn if you want to learn more from me. Happy to help.
Well, thank you so much for that session. I think it's pretty clear everyone really enjoyed that and already looking to watching it again, which is good. On that quick closing thought, because this is our last session for day one, implementation is exactly the point I wanted to finish the day on. We all love attending conferences, in-person, virtual, webinars, podcasts. They're all amazing, but they're actually pointless if you don't do something. This is lovely and it's great to see you all, but what I'd love to see is in a month's time, what has changed? What have you put into action? That's what matters. And so I'd really encourage you to take 10, 15 minutes, whatever you've got this evening before we go into tomorrow's sessions, just to reflect on what you're taking away and how you plan on putting it into action. If nothing else, it makes great stuff to share on social media or with your other attendees tomorrow as starts for networking conversations. But most importantly, that's how you're going to get most value out of attending IDTX, is deciding now what you're going to put into action tomorrow.